today. I'll start with what you all are really here for, is the joke of the week. This is a short one. The owner of a drugstore walks in to find a guy leaning heavily against the wall. The owner asks the pharmacist, "What's with that guy over there by the wall?" Well, the pharmacist said, "He came in here this morning to get something for his cough, but I couldn't find any of the cough syrup, so I gave him an entire bottle of laxatives." The owner says, "You idiot, you can't treat a cough with laxatives." And the pharmacist says, "Oh yeah? Look at him, he's afraid to cough." So I am classy as always. Sorry, Buddha. Anywho, today, as Brian said, we're going to study chapter 8 in our text, The Science of Mind, the first of 5 weeks. This week is the power of thought. Next week is the power of prayer, I believe, with Reverend Michelle. Then the power of faith with our wonderful practitioner, Tony. Then I come back on for the power of spiritual mind treatment, which is going to be a doozy, I'll tell you. And then after that is the power of love and mothers, I believe, with Tony. So that's what we're doing. And today I'm going to give you a real old-fashioned science of mind talk. We're going to talk turkey the science of mind way. And we're going to really get into this chapter. And the reason we're going to get into this chapter is because it really sets off this whole section. If you're going to follow along, by the way, again, we're chapter 8, and chapter 8 starts a whole new part 2 in the science of mind. So part 2 as a whole is called Spiritual Mind Healing. And the first chapter in Spiritual Mind Healing is chapter 8, The Power of Thought. Now, and if you have your book, you can just follow along, because I'm going to go through the book quickly and then give you some thoughts later. This chapter is really setting up this whole idea of spiritual mind healing. And he doesn't cover new ground in this chapter. He says kind of the same thing over and over through the book, but he does go deeper in it. And you can think of this chapter almost like a quick master class in how to think. And it was clearly important to Ernest Holmes that he start this section with this chapter. So that's why we're going to look at the entire thing, and I'll add some thoughts as we go along. As you know, thinking has always been very important to our philosophy. Our tagline for many years as a group was change your thinking, change your life. The philosophy that we belong to is called New Thought. So thought and thinking. And, you know, the grandfather of our movement was a man named Phineas Parker Quimby. And you can read 3 very thick, dense books on the power of thought from the late 1800s from Phineas, if you'd like to get even deeper into it. But that's the underpinnings of it. And even later writers who really cribbed from Ernest Holmes, like Norman Vincent Peale, The Power of Positive Thinking. So the power of thought is a bedrock. And, you know, it really sets up everything. So in the book, if you go to the book, the first section, it's divided in little sections, is called Spiritual Mind Healing. And the first thing he says in this is that healing is spiritual and it begins in the mind. In the book, he also quotes, "As a man thinketh in his heart, so is he," from the Bible. He who can thinks he can, or she. So he's basically laying out this argument that it all begins, any healing whatsoever begins in the mind. And in the next section, called The Basis for Mental Healing, he really says that the first thing he wants you to know or to remember, since he's told us this in previous chapters, is that we are surrounded by infinite intelligence. Okay, this is the base of the teachings. The most basic teaching of all of science of mind is there's a power for good in this universe greater than you, and you can use it. There's a power for good greater than you in this universe, and you can use it. That's what he's saying here. He says in that chapter, or in that section, he goes, first principle of understanding the operation of thought is that we are surrounded by an infinite intelligence. The possibility of healing anything rests entirely on the theory that we are surrounded by an infinite mind which reacts to our thought according to law. We get that to a small degree, but since we're spiritual beings, we sense this something greater, the cause of everything. And when he uses the words infinite intelligence, cause, mind, he capitalizes those words to show that he's talking about the big thing, the thing itself, he calls it. So all of this infinite intelligence, or the thing itself, or first cause, this is the thing that we are surrounded in and through at all times. And then he goes on in the act of incarnation. He says, he lets us know that we and this infinite intelligence are one, and that it operates through us, all right? This infinite mind, he says, can only respond by corresponding, meaning that it responds to us by a direct impartation of itself through us. And then he makes this really what I think of as just a bold and startling sentence. He says, the highest God and the innermost God are one God. That's so important for our philosophy, because we come from, many of us at least, come from schools of thought or religions that always thought that the outermost God was the God that we needed to pay attention to. And Ernest Holmes is flipping that script and using a mirror and pointing it right back inside of ourselves. And he calls it the act of incarnation. So beautiful. He's so clear, but he makes it so exciting to follow along. It operates through us. Well, then next, in the section called the activity of the mind, one mind, he says this. He says, infinite intelligence responds to our mental states. To the extent that we learn to control our mental state, the more we will automatically control our environment. So in this section, he says, not only, is there this infinite intelligence and it responds through us, but the more we become conscious of it, the more we learn to control it, the more we learn to control the environment around us. Next, in It Is Done to Us, he says this, and this is one of the best sentences of the whole chapter, I think. He says, we need not coerce, we do not create the power, but we must let this great power operate through us. We may not coerce or create this power, but I'll tell you this, we sure like to try to control it. We love to control the how. So while we may not have created the power, we are available to use it. Boy, sometimes though we get into the how of things and we block the flow of this divine power through us. Because instead of saying we would like to be more prosperous, we say, I want that specific check as a bonus from my company. And we only allow one avenue or channel of something to come to us. So while we don't create the power, we actually do try to coerce it at times. And what he's saying is, don't try to coerce the power. Let go, let it flow through you. It's infinite. Our conscious mind is not infinite. It is infinite. Why not, err on the side of infinity, of all possibility? He goes on to say in the section called Thought Force, he says this, for everything that happens in the objective world, there must be something in the subjective world which perfectly balances it. And then he gives a great example. He says, suppose the universe were nothing but water, and that every time this infinite intelligence moves, it forms ice, exactly corresponding to the thought. There might be countless pieces of ice of different form, color, size, but these pieces of ice would all still be water. Now, in that little section, he's telling us, let's see, I think I have right here our science of mind symbol. And what he's saying is it starts here in thought, and then thought moves into law and becomes an effect. And every effect that you see, whether it's a tangible effect or it's an effect in our lives, our financial effects or our relationship effects or health effects, things that we can't necessarily see with our two eyes, it all started here in a thought. Every effect has a cause. Furthermore, he says that everything, though, is of infinite intelligence if we just intelligently see it. So he's setting us up for when things start really get cooking here in the science of mind philosophy. The next section, he says, in the atmosphere of our thinking, he says, most of the inner processes of our thought have been unconscious. But when we understand the law, we learn to consciously embody what we wish and think of this only. And then we are drawn silently forward to it. We embody it first, then we're drawn to it. I think we often want it to be the other way. We become conscious. So much of what we've done is unconscious. Now, let me just pause for a second. The word unconscious, we don't actually talk about a lot in the science of mind. We talk a lot about conscious and subconscious, but unconscious means the using of the subconscious or law without even knowing that we do it. That's using something unconsciously. It's something that we've set up, and so much of our lives have been unconscious, truthfully, and that's what makes this teaching so exciting. That moment when we realize that we've been unconscious is really the moment where we wake up, and we can have multiple moments like that in our lives, and we do when we're on the spiritual path. I remember when I first discovered this philosophy, and I was reading books like You Can Heal Your Life by Louise Hay, Codependent No More, which is not necessarily new thought, but it really reframed things. Illusions by Richard Bach. Has anybody read these three? Out on the Limb by Shirley MacLaine was another one. Have you guys read any of those? And then other books as well, of course. I read all those at the same time, and I was like, oh my God, where were all of these ideas all of my life? Where was I? Oh, right, I was sleeping through it. But reading those books, it was just like every line, every sentence was just like a mind bomb that went off like, whoa, oh my gosh, I can create this? Whoa, I'm not responsible for other people's behaviors? Whoa, on and on. It was time to wake the heck up, and I did. And I know you guys have had that experience too, and that's partly why you are here in this chat room, in this room together. So, next section of the chapter, inducing thought. He says, this is such a great section, especially if you have anything going on in your life. I'm sure none of you have anything going on in your life. I'm sure it's all going perfectly and according to plan. But if by chance you know somebody who has something going on in their life, this is a great part. He says, that which thought has done, thought can undo. Habits of wrong thinking can be consciously and deliberately neutralized. Merely to abstain from wrong thinking is not enough. There must be active right thinking. And then he says this, we must become actively constructive and happy in our thinking, not merely passively so. Well, back when I first discovered a center like this, back, gosh, 1980 something, was Mile High Church in Denver. And, it was my first time. And the minister there said, it was a Wednesday night service, and the minister said the line that I remember forever, Reverend Marjorie Stahl. She said, "You are 100% responsible for your own life." And I was sitting in the back row, in case it was a cult, and half of the people in the room I could feel were just horrified by that thought, and the other half were relieved by that thought. And I was in the group that was relieved by that thought, that I was 100% responsible for my own life, precisely because what Ernest Holmes says right here, that which thought has done, thought can undo. And I thought, wow, okay, I'm in a mess. This was my thinking then. My life is a mess. I'm a mess, but I can now find a way out. If I got myself into this, I can get myself out of it. And by myself, I don't necessarily mean just me alone. It's opening to the greater self. But at that moment, I didn't understand the whole thing. But he goes on to say, it's not enough to just do it. We have to actively do it. We can't just passively do it. I'm sure you know people who say that they read, these wonderful books, or they might listen to some of this stuff on YouTube or whatever, but they're so negative. They're so negative, or they have all this drama. And I think in part that's because they are passively into it without actually doing it. And he says you can't be passive. You actually have to be active. And when we are active, we can neutralize the negativity, we can neutralize the limitations in our life, but it takes practice and it takes continued attention. Listen to this. This is from a book. I can't remember what it's called now. It was called for many years, Guidance from the Darkness, by a minister in our movement, Reverend Mary Murray Shelton. She has the Golden Gate Center out in, I think it's Corte Madera, California. And then she just redid the book a few years ago and changed the title. But anyway, she says this. She says, imagine that there's a field in front of you. And imagine that this field is full of plants and weeds and all sorts of stuff. It's just filled with it. And that you want to get on the other side. She said, if we were choosing to create a pathway through the field, the going would be difficult. We might need to hack our way in with a machete to get through all the grasses and the brush, and it could be a lot of work. With persistence, we would indeed have a new path. But if we happen to give up, the work we had done would deteriorate, and the field would quickly return to its original state. Should we persist with the path, the further we got with the work, the easier it would become. Once finished, however, once we get that path all the way through the field, we would have to use the path with regularity to keep it open and free-flowing. And then she says, this analogy describes what literally happens in the brain as we learn and practice new skills. Similarly, the old abandoned sequential neuron groove of a discarded habit, when no longer used, will eventually become overgrown and therefore less easy to use than in the past, much like an abandoned, overgrown path in a field or the woods. Because this is true, it is possible for us to break old habits permanently. We can, instead of focusing on the negative, we can really spend our time being actively constructive and happy in our thinking. Making change is difficult initially because the brain is conditioned to quickly respond to the old stimulus. But as we practice refraining from the old habit or the old way of thinking, the brain eventually stops reacting so quickly in anticipation of the familiar sequence. The longer we leave that specific neuron sequence unused, the old ways of thinking, the easier it will become to do so. The new behavior with which we replace the old habit then forms its own groove in our brain as it is repeated, supporting the new choice of action and making it easier to repeat each time in the future. That's like a scientific-ish way of saying what Ernest Holmes just says, that which thought has done, thought can undo. And that it's not enough that we refrain from wrong thinking, we must go into active thinking. That's exciting. That means that we're not helpless in this world. In the next section, choosing thought, he says, every day, every moment, every second, there is choice. There can be no choice unless there is something from which to choose. Otherwise, the ability to choose would merely be a fantasy. In other words, we were created with freedom of choice. He says, therefore, there must not be only the possibility of choice, but the liability of experiencing that which is chosen. Well, that's Ernest Holmes' way of saying, as above, so below, or as you think, so shall it be. Every choice we make has what he says in the liability of experiencing that which we have chosen. Liability doesn't always necessarily mean the negative thing. The liability means the consequence. The consequence. We always have choice, and he's trying to say to us very clearly, our lives are not merely up to fate. And our lives are not merely up at the mercy of something out there. But every choice we make is important. Marianne Williamson says, I keep this notebook of quotes that I like, and then I print them out and I put them in the notebook. I have all these notebooks filled with them so that if I need something, I just start flipping through the pages and then I magically stop on the right one for that day. Marianne Williamson says this, she says, everything becomes part of the journey into fear or the journey back to love, depending on how it's used by the mind. That's exactly what Ernest Holmes is talking about here. In the section, next section, he says, thoughts are things. All mind activity inevitably tends to create its physical correspondent. In health, for example, we do not maintain that this or that specific disease is always the result of thinking about such a condition, but we do assert that a prolonged discordant mental state is certain to eventuate in some form of physical ailment. That may not be front page news in 2021, that our thoughts correspond with our body. There's a mind-body connection. But when he first wrote this, the first edition of this textbook was 1926. And then the edition that we've been reading from is from 1938. Imagine how revolutionary it was. And probably people looked at it and thought, what? What the heck is he talking about? I remember in the 1980s when Carl Simonton wrote a book called Getting Well Again, where he talked about there's a mental connection to people who get cancer. He was an oncologist. And he was just like, people couldn't believe it. He was laughed at by the entire medical community. And but then a few years later, Bernie Siegel wrote a book called Love, Medicine, and Miracles, which further took it. And then Deepak Chopra came out with some of his early books, and suddenly things started changing. But Ernest Holmes wrote this 60, 70 years before that happened. That's amazing. And it's so important for us to remember now that every thought matters. The next section, one with God, he says, our own word has the power of life. If any word has power, it follows that all words have power. It means that every word which we hear, speak, or think has some power. That's why it's important that we are choosy, even in the music we listen to, because everything that goes in has power, everything that comes out has power, and everything we think has power. When I would say something that my mother didn't like, like if I said, gosh darn, or worse, my mother would always say, why are you choosing to use a nickel word when you can use a quarter word for free? She was trying to say there are higher ways of saying the same thing. There are better ways of saying the same thing. Ernest Holmes says, if any word has power, then they all have power, and they have the power that we give it. The next section, the power within, he says, God's creative power of mind is right here. And we have as much of this power to use as we believe in and embody. And then he goes on to say, near the end of the chapter, he says, we set our own limitations. And in that section, he uses this great metaphor. He says, the prodigal son remained a prodigal as long as he chose to do so. I mean, that's powerful too, because what he's saying is that we remain imprisoned by our conditions many of our conditions, as long as we choose to do it, our mental conditions especially. I remember a person who this is years ago, wanted to take my prosperity course. And actually they did take the prosperity course. And after the course, the person said, well, I'm going to do the stuff that you said, I'm just not ready for it. And I said, well, what exactly are you not ready for? Well, I'm just not ready for it. And I said, but you're not ready to receive more abundance? No, I'd like that. Okay, and you're not ready to kind of begin changing your life? Well, I like that, but I'm just not ready for it. And I kept thinking, what are you waiting for? Why are you waiting? But we do, and we will argue our way into it like this person did. In that book, Illusions by Richard Bach, he has the line that says, argue your own limitations, and sure enough, they're yours.
Okay.
So if we turn that around, we could say, argue our own freedom, and sure enough, it's ours. At the end of the chapter, he says this, it's in the section called Understanding. He says, our entire superstructure of this philosophy rests upon the fact that we be certain in our own minds that thought is creative. In other words, cause and effect. That we find ourselves in an undesirable condition in the face of all this is merely proof that we have limited ourselves by our very freedom. Because once we realize what we have, to stay there using the tools that we have means that we are choosing our own limitations. So that's the chapter. And I always say, whenever we study any chapter like this, why does it matter? How is it important, or why is it important? Well, it's important as this is another one of the quotes I pulled out this morning. This is from a song by Mary Chapin Carpenter, if you've heard of her. And she says in the song, we've got two lives. The one we're given, the other one we make. So we're all born. Every one of us in this room was born. I'm going to make that bold statement. We were all born. Everyone here has been born. That's the first life we're given. But then there comes a time when the rest of our lives, and this is especially true as we become adults, the rest of our lives is the life that we make. And that's what she means. And for us, Ernest Holmes says, it's important to aim high. Robert Johnson, the Jungian psychologist, said this, the meaning of life is not in the quest for one's own power or advancement, but lies in the service of that which is greater than one's self. See, once we know about these tools that Ernest Holmes teaches right here in chapter 8, if you just read chapter 8 of Science of Mind and didn't read anything else, it could change your entire life. Once we know it, then everything has changed. Everything. Just think about that. Think about how amazing infinite intelligence is, how big it is, and how we are so one with it. Just sink that in for a moment. how we connect with it right here through our thoughts, and that we can choose to connect with it at any and every moment we want. That's amazing. It reminded me so much, and I decided I was going to share this again with you. I shared it years ago, but it's this marvelous section of a talk that was given by this minister in our movement, Reverend Moira Fox. She has a center out in Redondo Beach, California, which I believe Neil was part of for a number of years. Anyway, she gave a talk on this very topic. The name of the talk was Infinite Intelligence, and she gave it in January of 2007. And I got a tape of it, and I listened to it over and over and over again because of this, what Ernest Holmes says in this chapter. So I'm going to close with this, and I'm going to read it the way she said it. I sat down, I love this talk so much, I sat down and I transcribed it word for word. I'm going to read just a little section of it for you, which is about this chapter. She said this, she says, Ernest Holmes says in the early pages of his book, Love and Law, he says, the one thing I ask of you is that you believe that this teaching works, that you believe that this teaching works because it is always and forever about beliefs. He says, don't only believe that it works, but go at it in such a way that it is as if you have known this teaching forever. And then in that awareness of that kind of knowingness, state your truth in a way that is of the feeling that failure is impossible. Go at it in a knowingness that suggests to you that failure is impossible. It is not possible to fail. Why? Because God cannot fail. And when you are in truth, and when you are aligned with truth, and when you are one with truth, you are the truth. And when you proclaim from that awareness of truth, you cannot fail because you are praying aright. You cannot fail when you are in the oneness of God. When you enter into the presence and leave all the dross behind. When you enter into the presence as the pureness of the life that you already are, and in that presence proclaim your word for the good that you desire, you cannot fail. Your word is made flesh and it comes to dwell among you because it's not you, it's the bigness in you that is bringing it about. And she goes on to say this. She says, this is awesome. It's incredible. Ernest Holmes says in that same book, in the early pages, he says, I cry. I cry. He says, I cry when I remember this bigness within me. I cry that it flows through me with all of its power. I cry. And she says, when did you last cry at this awareness? She finishes by saying, I think that all of our treatments and thoughts ought to be drenched in tears when we come into the realization of what is happening. She says, I can remember the very first time I really got it. And I knew I got it because I felt it and it felt itself in me. When I first realized that right where I am, God is, she says, I cried. How could this be? Right where I am, God is. And I went, oh my God. Oh my God, I think I have it. I think I've got it. I think I know what that is. See, once you get it, you can never go back. Once you get it once you've succeeded once, you can go back to it again and again and again. Ernest Holmes says in this chapter that we are surrounded by infinite intelligence, which indwells in each one of us, in you, and that you can connect with it and you can use it with your thoughts. And in turn, you can live from this place of high consciousness. That truth is everything. It's like finally waking up from the longest dream, how real it seemed, but that moment when love broke through and you knew it. Let's take this in. Let's pray. Let's use spiritual mind treatment. Let's use the power of thought, as Ernest Holmes encourages us and teaches us and inspires us to do. And we begin right here with the thing he began with in the chapter. We begin with infinite intelligence, that bigness that Reverend Moira Fox talked about. We breathe. And right here and right now, we have the moment of knowing. We have that moment of connecting with the bigness, the allness of all that is. We can feel it all the way into our spiritual DNA, this truth that there really is one power, this infinite intelligence, that it is, as Ernest Holmes said, is in and through and around us, and it is here right now. And we are one with it. We were made by it. Everything that we are is it. This is the moment of realization. Wow, this is everything. And we are knowing right now in our thoughts, the power of our thoughts. We lift ourselves up mentally to connect to that highest vibration, the highest we are able to connect to right here and right now, knowing that from this vantage point, life is so free. We're stepping out of limitations and into that infinite intelligence where everything not only is possible, but it is possible right now, and it's possible for each one of us. You don't have to be somebody with a degree, or you don't have to know somebody famous. Wherever you are, whoever you are, whatever's going on in your life right now, by lifting yourself up higher in this truth, your life will begin to reflect itself higher. Ernest Holmes says in this chapter, it is all available to you. So we believe that, we accept that, we are confident in it, and that becomes our truth right here and right now. And with such a grateful heart, that gratefulness with the realization that that's who we are and this is what we get to live. We release this now into law, not only proclaiming it, but proclaiming loudly and joyfully that this truth is true for me, for you, right now. And that is the truth, and so it is.
Thank you very much, Reverend Joel. That